وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. I want to kick off this morning by making a plea. I have a lot to say today, and I'm not going to be leaving any time for questions. So if you have any questions, perish the thought that you should not understand everything I say, but just in case, please store them up for Wednesday, because at least half an hour towards the end of that lecture I will be leaving free specifically for questions on any subject. Now, the reason I'm entering this plea is not because the questions might prove too much for me, although that would not be the first time that had happened, but because I have been landed with rather a lot to set before you today. The administrators, God bless them, have asked me to speak about Islamic theology and about Islamic mysticism in the course of a single morning. These are, in essence, the two most important subjects that we'll be looking at. So I have my work cut out, and I just ask you to sit back and just follow me. As an audience this morning, you're going to be rather like those of us who are being driven by John across some of the more difficult mountains of New Mexico yesterday. We just had to sit back and trust that we were safely heading towards some kind of coherent destination. This lecture is going to be a bit like that. Anyway, I want to start with an obscure fact about the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. One of the lesser-known facts about Kant is that his doctoral certificate, dated 1755, bears at the top the unmistakable Arabic words, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. These words, which are, of course, the first verse of the Holy Qur'an. Now, who on earth could have scribbled these in, and for what obscure purpose, is a teasing little problem that has occupied the leisure time of intellectual historians for many years. Did the anonymous graffiti artist, who knows perhaps even Kant himself, intend to suggest that there was any kind of congruence between his proto-idealistic philosophy and the teachings of the Arabian prophet? Or is the gesture, as is more usually held, some kind of ironic joke which upholds philosophy as necessarily the polar opposite of revelation? Well, probably we'll never know. We don't know who put those words in and for what reason. But for our purposes today, the question is surely quite a teasing one. If God has defined reality in the Qur'an, with the hadith providing, as it were, an apparatus of detailed footnotes, what use could anybody have for reason? After all, if God had intended and created the reason in order to penetrate the ultimate secrets of existence and the heavens and the earth, he wouldn't probably have bothered to provide revelation in the first place. Put more simply, can there be an Islamic philosophy or an Islamic philosophical theology? Or does the mind exist simply to work out some of the marginal entailments of the revealed law, with the heart given the job of assenting to the revelation and thus of knowing God? Well, there are a lot of Muslims, particularly today, who would find the presence of the Quranic words on Kant's certificate particularly horrifying. After all, Kant was the one who made Hegel possible, the man who floated these great metaphysical balloons to fill the spaces left by receding theology. And the job of philosophy in the 20th century basically has been to pop those balloons, leaving us, in most cases, with not very much. Now, this anti-philosophical judgment would be shared, interestingly enough, by mystics and by textual literalists alike. The book and the heart propose an epistemology, a means of acquiring knowledge that is guaranteed by Almighty God. The mind, however, seems to be too governed by its conditions and its training in space and time, and by the ego to be reliable. After all, the Qur'an itself begins by recounting how an angel fell from grace by using his mind to defy God. Refusing to bow before Adam, the angel who later became Satan, said, "I am better than him. You have created me from fire and created him from mere clay." So the very existence of the principle of evil in the world, this Quranic text seems to be suggesting, comes from the use or the abuse of the intellect. It's an interesting comparison, incidentally, that the Bible starts out with the narrative of the physical creation of the world, whereas the Qur'an, if you set aside the preliminary first chapter, which is essentially a kind of introductory prayer, the second chapter of the Qur'an begins with the narrative of the creation of the human soul and the human being. It's in the first 30 or 40 verses of the second chapter, if you want to check it out. And this view has been quite widespread. You can't really use reason to determine ultimate truths. For instance, there's a very famous Syrian theologian following the literalist Hanbali school of law called Ibn Qudama. He died in 1223. Very representative of this literalist tendency. And he wrote a whole book called The Censure of Dialectical Theology, which was all about how wicked and blasphemous it is to use the mind in order to attempt to penetrate the divine secrets. So he says, we must renounce the evilness of theology as shown in its condemnation by our religious leaders, who are universally agreed that its advocates are partisans of heretical innovations and abominable error. Good piece of medieval rhetoric there, but fairly characteristic of a certain type of literalist polemic against any use of reason in religious discourse. That kind of attitude was fairly common amongst the ulama, the religious scholars, and we can clearly see that it was even more common amongst the pretty non-intellectual masses. God and his prophet didn't use philosophy, so how can we have the temerity to do so? So perhaps we should acquiesce in the polemical Muslim position that you often hear in sessions of dialogue, for instance, that blames the modern world, seen as godless hubris, on a readiness to follow the mind that grew from medieval Christian intellectualism. One of the big contrasts between the intellectual history of Christianity and that of Islam is that in Christianity, the crown of the intellectual disciplines was always theology. That was the central Christian intellectual concern. Whereas in Islam, although there was, as I'll go on to explain, forms of sophisticated theology, nonetheless their existence was always somewhat marginal. They were taught and continue to be taught in the great orthodox faculties of learning. But the principal Muslim intellectual endeavor has traditionally been mysticism rather than theology. So in classical Christianity, again, these are huge generalizations, but in this context we have to rely on them. In classical Christianity, theology is at the center of our struggle to know God. In classical Islam, mysticism is at the center, and the sheer volume of the literature generated by each tradition bears this out. So, to get back to this polemical point that you'll sometimes hear, you'll find a lot of Muslims today contemplating the lack of intellectual moorings of modernity, or what we nowadays term postmodernity, and hurt also by the paradox of the brazen triumph of modernity, point to the huge intellectual energy which Christians traditionally invested in philosophical theology as the clue to the emergence of that Enlightenment rationalism which ultimately let the Greek genie out of the bottle. It was the Christians, according to this view, that released the genie. The Muslims always kept it corked up. So the Muslims were the wise ones who rejected the excessive use of pure reason, following either the scriptures or the delights of mystical speculation, or quite frequently, both put together. Now, obviously, you don't need to know too much about medieval Christian intellectual history to realize that this polemic actually misrepresents the classical Christian scholastic position. It is true that they relied on the intellect, but their definition of the term intellect was quite different to the one we use today. For them, ratio, the use of ratiocination dialectics taking place in the mind, was a path principally to the articulation and not to the discovery of truth. The truth for the Christian scholastics was located in the thing that they called the intellect, which, unlike our modern definition, actually included several other phenomena, notably the intuitive, divinely inspired capacity to discover truth, providential intuition as part of the faculty of intellect. Nowadays we exclude it. So we find, for instance, in Dante, he tells Beatrice towards the close of the Divine Comedy, "Now do I see that never may the intellect be sated unless that truth do shine upon it." So philosophy in medieval Christendom was famously the handmaid of theology. There were some who tried to promote it beyond its ability. The medieval Averroists, particularly of Padua, were those who thought that if revelation and reason collide, then reason has to be given priority. A number of Averroists, such as Siger of Brabant, great medieval Christian theologian, were actually smacked down for doing this. And interestingly, the Averroism that they were bringing in came from the Islamic world. Averroes was, of course, Ibn Rushd, the famous philosopher and Maliki jurist of Cordoba. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that this traditional Muslim critique actually misunderstands what the scholastics were doing. But it does reciprocate in quite an interesting way the mirror image of this, which was the classical or early modern Christian repudiation or interrogation of Islamic reason. We're told, particularly by 19th century Orientalists such as Ernest Renan, one of the great intellectuals of 19th century France, and also by a number of Orientalists in the present century, that Islam cannot foster a reason-based theology because Islam emphasizes practice and not thought. The very word Islam itself, these people would tell us, implies a kind of blind, unthinking submission to the inscrutable will of God. And what the religious leaders require is not orthodoxy so much as orthopraxy, in other words, practicing in the right way, not believing in the right way. Orthodoxy in Islam being limited to assent to a very few elementary propositions, perhaps even just the two propositions enshrined in the Shahada itself. Now, this traditional European assumption is, I think, that Islam is a kind of regrettable lapse into Judaic formalism. And it has a Judaic type of God who is so transcendent that the mind simply cannot reach him, and hence this kind of religion is suited to less intellectually gifted people, desert dwellers for whom the image is that the sky is very clearly distinguished from the earth. The triune Christian God is an intellectual stimulus and a challenge, whereas Allah or Yahweh is unknowable, and hence all his devotees can do is to busy themselves with discussing the laws in some kind of casuistic or even Pharisaic fashion. So we have a kind of double smugness in recent debate between Islam and Christendom. Some Muslims and some Christians purveying the image of a uniformly non-intellectualist Islam. However, recent scholarship, very thankfully, has managed to overturn this image. And this overturning has come about in two ways. Firstly, we have, thanks to research in the archives, a growing realization that medieval Muslims did, in fact, do a lot of genuine and profound theologizing, but that given the way in which knowledge was ordered in classical Islamic civilization, this theology doesn't always appear where a Westerner would expect to find it. So books on theology might be quite small creedal statements, but in fact you find a lot of what Christians would regard as theological issues discussed, for instance, in books on jurisprudence. The preliminary chapters on Islamic jurisprudence often contain issues on what is the nature of man, who is actually required to follow the law, who has a soul, who doesn't, and so forth. Similarly, of course, a lot of theological discussion took place in the flourishing traditions of Islamic mysticism. Secondly, there has been a lot of research being done into Islamic formal theology itself, which goes under the name of kalam. This is one of the key technical terms in Islamic studies. Kalam, K-A-L-A-M, which simply means speech. And it became applied to theology because one of the early discussions that the kalam theologians were interested in was the question of God's speech, i.e. the Qur'an. Is it created in time or has it always existed? So kalam means systematic theology, rationalizing theology. And we know that classical Islamic thought did not so much make war on the Greeks as enlist at least some of them as allies. So this medieval kalam tradition is not just some kind of scripturalist piety, platitudes, rephrasing the truths of Scripture, but actually builds, in many cases, a very sophisticated and internally coherent metaphysical superstructure, which in many ways operates in a kind of register that's not too far from that of medieval Christian scholasticism. Now I'll be talking about both of these traditions today, the kalam, i.e. the theological dimension of Islam, and mysticism in due course. But before I can do this and get onto the real subject of today's lecture, which is namely these two areas of Iman and Ihsan mentioned in the hadith of Gabriel, I want to backtrack a little bit historically and investigate and retell the narrative of the early Muslim community, because Islamic theology, like Christian theology, is something that can only be understood in terms of its historical background and the processes which brought it about. Remember that right at the beginning of Islam, there was no systematic theology and there was no systematic mysticism in the forms that later became normative in Islam. This famous hadith of Gabriel, which I passed around in my first lecture, does allude to the legitimacy of levels that transcend the pure outward forms of Islam, that which Renan and his friends would consider to be normative Islam, orthopraxy, the 5 pillars, etc. Because the hadith of Gabriel, which is unanimously accepted as canonical by the Muslims, explains explicitly that there are higher dimensions. There is a level of Iman, which means confident, faithful trust in the existence and goodness of God, and Ihsan, which means excellence, explicitly defined in this hadith as meaning spiritual excellence. Now, these things obviously exist concentrically, both in individuals and in society. And the hadith makes this quite clear. It's easy to practice the outward rituals of a religion. You can be a very stupid person or a very bad person and still practice Islam well. You can pray 5 times a day, fast, etc. So you can exist in this realm. However, a smaller number of human beings are able to move up to the second area of Iman and actually internalize the meanings of these outward practices so that they become true believers and do it sincerely for God. Of those people, again, a smaller minority will be called to the level of Ihsan, which leads to sainthood itself, the ultimate goal of religious practice in all religions, selflessness and absolute goodness and living joyously in the presence of God. So these 3 things exist concentrically. Now you may remember that I pointed out that in fact less than 10% of the Qur'an is concerned with those things that we were put in the outermost of these circles, the area of Islam. In fact, some people say that only about 80 or 90 of the verses of the Qur'an, which are about 6,500 altogether, are actually to do with do's and don'ts, which is a good antidote to those who would regard the Qur'an as primarily a legalistic document. In fact, we find a lot more about these higher areas. Iman in particular is constantly referred to in the Qur'an, and there are also many mystical allusions. So one of the interesting things about classical Islamic literature is that you will find a higher percentage of Quranic allusions in doctrinal and particularly in classical mystical texts than you will find in the texts that are simply about practice and law. So, the source for all of this is, of course, the Qur'an itself, and I want to go back and see what the Qur'an itself has to say about these 2 higher types of knowledge. The Qur'an is the speech of God. It's also speech about God. In fact, it's entirely about God, and the other themes simply exist there to elucidate its central concern. But how is this Quranic God to be known? Well, the God that the Qur'an proposes cannot be known directly by the rational faculties, whether these be ratiocinative or perhaps sensory faculties. You can't see or feel God. This is obvious. And the best known proof text for this is Surah 7, verse 143. And when Moses came to our appointed place and his Lord had spoken to him, he said, "My Lord, show me yourself that I may look upon you." He said, "You will not see me, but look at the mountain. If it stands still in its place, then shall you see me." And when his Lord revealed his glory to the mountain, he sent it crashing down. And Moses fell down in a swoon. And when he woke, he said, "Glory to you, I turn to you repentant, and I am the first to believe." In other words, you can't see God. One of the great revelations on Sinai is that God does not reveal himself in that crude way. So what does this tell us about our ability to know God? We cannot perceive his essence. It's simply too glorious. A famous hadith tells us that God is concealed behind 70,000 veils of light, and were they to be lifted, the flashing light of his face would destroy anyone who looked upon him. However, we can know him through his attributes, because they're around us to see quite clearly. We can deduce conclusions about the attributes of God from the saving events recorded in the Qur'an, what he does with his prophets and his chosen ones. But also, and even more conveniently, God actually names himself in the Qur'an. Several prophetic hadith indicate that God has 99 names. These are in the Qur'an, but they're scattered about. You won't find one chapter that dishes up the 99 names of God. But early generations lost no time in assembling these and meditating upon them. Some of these affirm the moral character of deity. For instance, the Qur'an says, God is compassionate and merciful, he is the loving kind, he is the just, he is the clement, etc. Others point to more abstract metaphysical truths about God. For instance, in the famous closing verses of Surah 59, "He is God, besides whom there is no other God, knower of the visible and the invisible. He is the compassionate and merciful. He is God, besides whom there is no other God. He is the sovereign Lord, the Holy One, the source of safety, the keeper of faith, the guardian, the mighty, the powerful, the proud. Exalted is he above any partners they ascribe to him. He is God, the creator, the originator, the fashioner. His are the most beautiful names. All that is in the heavens and the earth glorifies him, and he is the mighty, the wise." So immediately we see in the Qur'an a distinction between the moral and metaphysical qualities in God as disclosed in the names. But a further and related distinction also imposes itself. This divinity, Allah, is axiomatically one. This is the primary message in theology that the Qur'an gets across. He is one both in himself, and this is the name that is applied to this aspect of the divine unity, Al-Ahad, one unified, unique, unitive creator, Al-Ahad, and he's also one as he relates to creation. This comes from the same root, has different resonances, Al-Wahid. So this oneness has a dimension of transcendence, and it also has a dimension of immanence. Remember, I mentioned briefly this distinction between tanzih and tashbih. With John's permission, I'll expunge these. Have you all taken these down? Yes. Okay. Clear a bit of space here. Tanzih refers to the divine transcendence, the unique, high, unknowable deity. Fundamental term in Islamic theology. And the term in which it exists in a kind of dynamic tension is tashbih, which is the divine immanence. So if you look at the handouts, I've dug out a few Quranic quotes here. The first one, God is beyond everything that they describe. Can't be put into words, the unknowable God. But wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. That's the second register of the divine oneness, which is tashbih. So we find in this first register, tanzih, that the prayer, the 5 daily prayers of Islam, the salat that happen in the mosque, emphasize this first register. The keynote of the prayer is this constantly repeated phrase, Allahu Akbar, the non-comparative comparative God is greater, which is referring to the divine transcendence and God as Al-Ahad. In other words, he is greater than whatever we can assert about him. and greater than any conceptualization that we might have of him. So this divine transcendence is written into the most fundamental devotional practice of Islam, and it's also a key Quranic postulate which emphasizes the gulf between the absolute and ever-living God on the one hand and the relative contingent nature of creation. Between the two, there is no commensurability, no common measure. In the second register, we find the Quran balancing it with some clear assertions of the divine proximity. I mentioned one from this handout. We also find, for instance, famously in Surah 50, verse 16, we, i.e. God, are nearer to man than his jugular vein. In Surah 8, verse 24, God stands between a man and his heart. Verses speak of God's hand, his face, and so forth. These anthropomorphisms are, of course, to be understood only metaphorically. And the Quran also introduces a concept which is the unfolding of the tashbih, of the immanence, which it calls barakah. I don't know if some of you got to see a movie that appeared 2 or 3 years ago by Coppola, which is called Barakah. It was shot in 70mm, and really to get the impact of it, you have to see it on a proper big screen. And it's a narrative-less sequence of incredibly beautiful images that attempt to convey, in as much as the silver screen ever can, the sense of the sacred. This idea, as we look, for instance, out of our windows here at Dar al-Islam and see this staggering scenery, that there is something infused into the natural world that is not of this world, but that recalls the presence of the divine and invites us towards it. And this concept of barakah is a key Quranic term. And in fact, Coppola noted that he'd borrowed this term specifically from the Qur'an and from Islamic spirituality. The usual translation of this term is blessing or grace, but that doesn't exactly get across the almost electrical quality of this force. Now, the Quranic view of the natural world is precisely that it is a locus of barakah and a locus of theophanies, of manifestations that recall and point to the divine source of everything. The world is an endlessly complex, exquisite unfolding of the 99 names. The existence of the world is other than God. Islam does not go in for Hindu-style pantheism, equating the world in any sense with God. No, the tanzih is always recognized. However, the wujud, the being of the world, does partake in an ultimately inexpressible way in the divine nature, inasmuch as the world is a kind of shadow of God. That's the most that can be said. So we find, again in this surah that I pointed out, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. So this tension between the moral and the metaphysical attributes of God, seen differently, the divine transcendence and the divine immanence, is the most fundamental of all of the Quranic postulates. And it underlies most of subsequent Muslim theological and also mystical reflection. Theologians obviously focus their attention on the register of tanzih, the divine transcendence, whereas mystics are interested in the divine immanence. But in fact, if you look at the literature, you'll see that neither was fixated on one to the exclusion of the other. And it was typical in medieval Islam for mystics also to be theologians also to be mystics. Ghazali was the most obvious example of this. So you'll find in the theological tracts, flashes of mystical insight come in. Also, the mystics will be happy to introduce formal theological themes. Now, this tension dictates the key features of Muslim theology, and you won't understand why Muslim theology is the way it is without understanding this dialectic. And I want to look now in a little bit more detail at the best-known early controversy in Islamic theology, which manifests very clearly this key distinction. And this controversy ranged believers in free will, on the one hand, those who upheld God's moral nature, against determinists, people who believed everything is predetermined in order to preserve the stress on God's more metaphysical qualities, the divine omnipotence and so forth. What does the Qur'an itself have to say as a basis for this discussion? Well, the Qur'an says that God is powerful over all things. He is preeminently an omnipotent deity. He has a qudra, the divine power, which is constantly, incessantly manifested in every movement, every stillness, every event in the created world. And this qudra is so powerful that it seems, at first sight, to overwhelm any contingent potency or power that individual people might think they have. So we find the Qur'an saying, God created you and created what you do. Seemingly quite a determinist statement. The problem for the early Muslims as they tried to frame a theology was that God also has to be morally consistent. So we find in Surah 4, verse 49, God shall not wrong a man so much as the weight of the hair on a date stone. And in Surah 45, verse 22, God created the heavens and the earth with the truth so that each soul might be recompensed according to what it has earned, with no one wronged. So the first great doctrinal problem in Islam, and really the most recurrent one in our theology, involves the evident tension between these two rival, almost, registers of the divine perfection. The Qur'an juxtaposes them. But how can God be just when he rewards or punishes human actions which he himself, through his qudra, has known were going to happen, has actually determined anyway? So in Surah 2, verse 7, we read, concerning those who willfully deny the truth, God has sealed up their hearts, and a heavy covering lies over their eyes and their ears. Now, if God himself has sealed up their hearts, how can he punish them in consequence when they sin? Well, this apparent contradiction is, of course, simply the Islamic form of the most taxing difficulty which besets any theistic religion. Judaism and Christianity famously experienced their own disputes here, with the libertarians, those who emphasized human free will, particularly in Judaism, generally getting the better of the argument. In Christianity, the determinist position lingers on today in some churches with a strong Calvinistic influence. Some of the Scottish churches, for instance, influenced by Knox, do very much believe in a form of predestination. And the coherence of predestinarian ideas is still at least tacitly recognized by many others. In Islam, both positions seem to be vindicated by the revelation itself. God is perfect both morally and metaphysically. First believers accepted this on trust and were content to leave the paradox unexplained. However, as the early Muslims started to debate with philosophically much more sophisticated at that time Christians, particularly in places like Damascus, this simply led to embarrassment. The apparent tension couldn't be explained. And the two rival positions, voluntaristic and deterministic, soon became identifiable dogmatic tendencies within the early community of believers. So some people felt themselves inclined to belief in free will, others were more interested in deterministic ideas. And the hardest line of all of the determinists were people called mujbira. These were absolute determinists. They said everything you do has actually been decided upon not by you, that's just an illusion, but by God himself. These people seem to have been supported by the ever cynical Umayyad regime in Damascus for the simple reason that it was politically useful. If people thought that everything in the world was determined by God anyway, then they would be less inclined to challenge the corruption of the regime. So it had political backing. Opposed to the mujbira, you find believers in free will, and these people are called Mu'tazilites. Now these distinctions, believe it or not, continue to endure because Shia Islam, which accounts for maybe 10% of the world's Muslim, is still, for the most part, get rid of that, strongly influenced by later Mu'tazilite thinking. And a later scholar describes the view of the Mu'tazilites as follows. Man is the creator of his deeds, good or bad, and hence is deserving of reward or punishment in the afterlife for whatever he does. The Mujbira didn't agree with this because they thought it somehow suggested there's a plurality of creators in the world, hence it's a polytheistic doctrine. Let me try, at the risk of perhaps losing you, to go into this very interesting debate in a little bit more depth. I'll be skating very superficially over some of the other controversies in Islamic theology, but this I think we can use as a case study. The Mu'tazilites shared with all of the people of Kalam, those who liked systematic theology, a belief in atoms. They thought that there is such a thing as the smallest possible particle in the world, and that was the basis of their cosmology. Now, their opponents held that the motions of atoms were not related causally. What does that mean? Well, the Ash'arites thought that there is no natural causality in the world, which is an apparently rather dramatic and seemingly unscientific attitude, which says, for instance, that if I throw a football at the window, normally you'd expect the window to break, but that's not because the football is making the window break, that's because God is affecting the window directly and causing it to break. And they thought that if you affirmed any secondary causes in creation, you were thereby limiting the omnipotence of God. And this continues to be the mainstream Islamic view. And it's the one that's associated with a third great tendency in classical Islamic theology, one that still predominates and is regarded as the orthodoxy, the Ash'arites. Ash'arites named after the great early theologian Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. And what the Ash'arites thought was there is no natural causality. Causality in the world is simply an illusion. They developed a system which modern philosophers would refer to as occasionalism, which has sometimes popped up in Western thought. Malebranche is the most obvious European exponent of an occasionalistic theory. They said that atoms do not have a duration. An atom is created instantaneously in time and vanishes instantaneously. And hence you cannot say that there is any kind of natural causality in the world. You can say that Act A may give rise predictably to Act B, but that is only because God's actions in the world are consistent. You can assume if you chuck your football at the window that God will cause the window to break because that's the way he operates. But you must not say that it's the football that's doing it. That is perceived as infringing on the divine omnipotence. Now this view is an interesting example of how a classical Islamic thesis can actually be sustained in the modern world. And there's actually at the moment a great revival of Ash'arite theology, particularly in places like Turkey. The most lively Muslim theology at the moment is actually taking place in Turkey. Because in the 19th century, when there was a very mechanistic view of the universe, people thought this was simply absurd. They knew what atoms were, they could measure them, they could show them up in their equations, and Ash'arism simply seemed to be wrong. Atoms did have a duration. Mu'tazilites looked as if they were right. And in the early 20th century, partly for this reason, there was a kind of revival of Mu'tazili thought in Islam. More recently, however, with the new physics is always calling itself new, but with the new generation of physicists, for instance, in Cambridge we have somebody called Stephen Hawking, who's produced this famous book, The Brief History of Time. What Hawking is saying is that you cannot, in fact, speak of the duration of atoms. In fact, you can't even speak coherently of the existence of any subatomic particles. You can see them as particles, you can see them as waves, you can see them as instantaneous instances of a universal phenomenon that actually encompasses the entire universe. I'm not going to try and summarize his argument in a few sentences. But the point is that Ash'arism is now regarded as more cosmologically coherent than it used to be because of this notion of occasionalism. We don't need to look at this in detail, but the conclusion is Ash'arism has always denied real causality. Now, the reason why the Ash'arites were interested in this is that the Mu'tazilites, following the opposite position, thought that this kind of metaphysical speculation simply is beside the point. The most important point is that God has to remain the author of a coherent religion, and he has to be morally coherent in genuinely punishing or rewarding human beings for what they do. And this can only make sense if the relationship between human act and moral consequence is grounded in predictable and real moral causal laws. So the Mu'tazilites hold atoms do have a duration. They're not recreated in each instant by God. And they said if we accept this, then automatically we have to accept that we can speak meaningfully of the generation of acts. They call this tawallud, generation of acts by human beings. God's acts in the world are direct, mubashir. Human acts are generated through this tawallud. And there are divisions amongst the Mu'tazilites over what this could mean. Now this ties in very much with the related question of theodicy. Those of you who've looked at Christian theology will know that this means the complex of problems relating to the existence of evil in the world. One of the biggest dilemmas for theistic theology, and recently reintroduced to me by my 4-year-old daughter when she came in from the garden with a sad expression on her face and said, "Daddy, why did God create stinging nettles?" And I didn't have an answer for her. And you have to be a good deal older than 4 before you can even begin to understand the variant responses that the theistic religions have given to this difficult problem. The Mu'tazilites insisted that good and evil are intrinsic properties, and that when human beings work evil or bring about evil in the world, it is not ultimately God that can be blamed for that. Whereas the Ash'aris believed that there is no intrinsic reality to good and evil. This is another of the classic propositions of Muslim theology. According to the Ash'aris, good actions are good only because God himself considers them to be good. And this position foreshadows, I think, some debates in modern Christian theology, such as you'll find discussed in the book by Alistair MacIntyre called Beyond Virtue. The great question of whether something is good because it's good in some, perhaps some philosophically unframeable, absolute way, or because God has made it good. Is there some reality to good and evil in the world? Fundamental ethical argument. The Mu'tazilites said the perfection of God demands that he do things that are truly good, not good simply because he does them. Similarly, God commands mankind to things that are authentic and are not just some kind of conventional virtue. Good and evil, the Mu'tazilites thought, can be established on purely rational grounds, and God is bound to act in accordance with that system of values. So they said that the Qur'an condemns female infanticide not to establish the principle that female infanticide is wrong, but in conformity with an absolute principle that the thing is wrong. So on the basis of this understanding, the Mu'tazilites quite simply limited God. They said that he was constrained by an axiology, by a system of values that was beyond him, that transcended him. They said, in short, that his omnipotence, his qudra, did not include the ability to will what is evil. That would entail some kind of futility, what they called abath, on his part. And it would invite, of course, the conclusion that he himself is evil. So God must consistently will the good. He cannot will man to sin, nor can he withhold guidance. If people go astray, that's always their choice, and God can't be blamed. And so concerned were they with this, with upholding this principle of the divine justice, that they even developed a further thesis which said that every suffering in the world has to receive a due compensation. So if you stumble over a stone in this world, God will recompense you for it, either later in this life or in the next life. So we find most of the Mu'tazilites even saying that animals will go to heaven, which orthodoxy has not accepted, because animals can suffer in this world. God, out of his justice, cannot allow that to be the end of the story, therefore he will give them pleasure in the next world to compensate for what they've suffered. The Orthodox, of course, never went along with this. While kindness to animals is very much part of the Muslim ethical package, Orthodox Islam has assumed that animals, because they don't have the ability to choose between good and evil, cannot be resurrected to face judgment. So we have this characteristic Mu'tazilite doctrine, which you'll still find taught in some of the theological colleges in Shia parts of the world, such as Iran, for instance, which is that God must act to secure the best interests of his creation. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَجِبُ عَلَيْهِ رِعَايَةُ الْأَصْلَحِ in Arabic. Now, to the Ash'aris, this seemed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with a certain type of over-rational Mu'tazilite mentality. It imposes a compulsion upon God, and such apparent compulsions are simply the inventions of limited human intellects, which God himself has created and which simply are not qualified to rise sufficiently high to decide on what is or is not possible for God. Now, the classical argument which the Ash'aris deploy is called the story of the three brothers. This is a story of three imaginary brothers, and we're told that one of them was good, one of them was wicked, and the third of them died as a child. So the first is in paradise, the second is in hell, and the third is in a limbo where he experiences neither reward nor punishment. Now, the third in the next life explains to God that he'd never been given a chance to obey God and hence merit paradise. So he complains to God for having made him die before he had a chance to work for heaven. Because the laws of Islam and the moral law obviously does not apply to children as it does to adults. And the reply is that God made him die young because he knew that if he grew up to maturity, he would actually be a sinner and hence merit hell. The Mu'tazilites could see the reason behind that. And then the second brother speaks up and asks why he had not been made to die young as well, so that he would be spared hell. And of course the Mu'tazilites on their system had no answer to this second question. And this story becomes the classical Ash'ari orthodox refutation of Mu'tazili rationalism. The idea being that by attempting to impose these limits on God's action and imposing human categories of good and evil on God, one ends up simply in absurd paradoxes of this kind. The later writers on heresy cite this story as the reason for the conversion of al-Ash'ari himself. He had been a Mu'tazilite in the southern Iraqi city of Basra and then converted to Ash'arism, according to the story, because the Prophet had appeared to him in a dream and urged him neither to accept the simple textual scriptural literalism of many of the hadith scholars and the Hanbalis, one extreme, nor to go to the other extreme and become lost in this kind of rationalistic speculation. And so Ash'ari himself charts a kind of median position between these two that is scripturally sensitive, but also includes rationalistic possibilities. And certainly in developed Ash'ari thought, we find the considerable importation of Greek categories, and particularly the use of Greek logic in Islamic theology. So Ash'ari theology, Muslim Orthodox theology that is essentially a kind of median or compromise position between strict scriptural literalism on the one hand and freewheeling rationalism on the other. The great period of Ash'ari orthodoxy was really the 12th and the 13th century. It took some time for this tradition to evolve. Its classical exponent is a truly brilliant mind called al-Shahrastani. Shahrastani wrote a book called Nihayat al-Iqdam, which is translated as the Summa Philosophiae. There's an English translation of it if you want to look at it. And books like Shahrastani's are still the standard set texts for Muslim theology in the great Sunni universities. Now, in Shahrastani's developed position, we find the final and definitive orthodox Sunni repudiation of the Mu'tazilite ethical system. To support the Ash'arite denial of the intrinsic nature of good and evil, Shahrastani conjures up a kind of thought picture which later becomes fairly standard in the literature. He asks us to imagine a man who is born fully competent to understand and to reason. He's intelligent, but is brought up in some remote place, desert island for instance, and has absolutely no ethical training of any kind, no moral education. Such a person obviously will be enabled, as he grows up, to see the truth of, say, mathematical propositions, but he will have no verdict to give on the judgment that murder is wrong, for instance, or that God is bound to condemn it. He simply won't have been trained into that view. So for Shahrastani, there is no analogy between theoretical and moral propositions. This desert island person, if he witnesses a murder, will certainly understand the mechanical, medical processes by which the victim dies, but he'll have no knowledge of whether the thing is actually good or bad. So these moral concepts for Shahrastani do not form part of the essential attributes of the event. But for God, according to the Ash'aris, murder would simply be morally neutral. So in this sense, you can say that God wills everything in the world without ever willing something that is evil. This is the crux of the argument. What he wills is by definition good, since the only coherent, non-subjective definition of what is good is what God does. So you can no more say that God wills evil than you can say that the rays of the sun are dark. It's simply what philosophers would call a category mistake. By definition, he cannot do what is evil. So evil in the world is ultimately not a reality, but simply an illusion caused by necessarily inadequate human perception. There are a number of other arguments here in the theology which I'll have to, as I say, skate over. Another one which I won't attempt to explain in detail but just briefly outline is the key Ash'arite doctrine of kasb. Again, the subject of some very brilliant medieval expositions. Kasb means literally acquisition. And this was a device which the Ash'aris employed in order to deal with the problem of theodicy, how God can apparently judge people for evil actions when he is himself the omnipotent creator of all actions. The Ash'aris very briefly distinguish between God's creation of acts on the one hand and man's acquisition of acts on the other. They thought there was a kind of almost instantaneous bubble, almost of free will, around the human soul at the moment that a human being acts, and that is sufficient grounds for God to reward or to condemn us. And it's such a subtle doctrine that, in fact, there's an Arabic proverb now. If something is really complicated, you say it's more subtle than the kasb of al-Ash'ari. But those of you who are interested in following the rigorous arguments through to their conclusions, I can give you references in modern studies of Muslim philosophical theology. And the difficulty of this doctrine, in fact, encouraged many later Muslim thinkers to view the whole question of predestination versus free will as actually something that cannot be adequately framed within the categories and the concepts of formal theology. And increasingly in Islamic thought, we find it being dealt with by mystics rather than by theologians. I mentioned earlier that in Christianity, formal theology has traditionally been central, mysticism something marginal, even sometimes questionable, whereas in Islam, the reverse has been the case. And we find in this case that the medieval doctrine of kasb was accepted by the consensus of medieval Muslim intellectuals. But the more satisfying resolution of this paradox was attempted by the mystical thinkers. So we find Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, affirming acquisitionist theology as being part and parcel of the formal creed, but he suggests a further level of truth. He says man is made in God's image, as the famous hadith records. And this recalls the Quranic statement that God himself has blown something of his spirit, his ruh, into Adam, the primordial type of humanity. Which means that man, as a theomorphic being, partakes, obviously in a contingent way, in all of the divine attributes. And this includes the attribute of will. So just as God is the compassionate, human beings can be compassionate as well, in a contingent way. God is the just, human beings can be just. God is the strong, human beings can be strong. All of the 99 names can have a human application. Similarly, God is al-Murid, he is the one who has volition, who has will. And human beings also, in a contingent way, can participate in this. And it is this participation, Ghazali thought, that contains the solution to this paradox. Ghazali says that moral decisions located in the conscience, the self-aware core of the human creature, are not located in the mind, as the theologians supposed, but in the ruh, this divine spark within man, this kind of spark which is separated in a ultimately illusory fashion from the divine fire, as the mystics saw it. And Ghazali says, وَأَمَّا سِرُّ الْقَدَرِ فَهُوَ الَّذِي تَحَيَّرَ فِيهِ الْأَكْثَرُونَ. As for the secrets of God's decree, this is the subject which has bewildered most of humanity. وَمُنِعَ مِنْ إِفْشَاءِ سِرِّهِ الْمُكَاشَفُونَ. And those who have been given mystical insights and illumination by God are prohibited from disclosing it. The secret seems to be, inasmuch as we can frame it, that when man truly becomes God's deputy on earth, we see that the separation of man's will from the will of God is, like all other separations, merely an illusion. So that's a case study of how theological questions ultimately ended up moving into a mystical register, which is quite a common feature of Muslim intellectual history. And the final satisfying solution that Muslims found was in the realm of mysticism. Well, I've been talking for some time on Muslim theology. Probably I've done no more than bewilder you and convince you that this is as intricate and hard to understand as other theologies. It is a brilliant and a very diverse tradition of thought. What I want to do for the rest of this lecture is to follow this cue of Ghazali's and turn to the third core aspect of the totality of the religion of Islam, the level of ihsan. Now, before I do this, I think I should repeat the disclaimer that I issued at the beginning of my lectures, namely that a formal presentation like this can't encapsulate the reality of the spiritual life. And there's a quote here again from Ghazali who expresses this point. Such ideas, i.e. transcendent mystical ideas, are like virgins, and the hand of words cannot reach the edge of their veil. Even though our task is to marry the virgin ideas to the men of words in the bedchambers of speech, yet verbal expressions cannot but be allusions to misleadingly different ideas. But having uttered that caveat, I'm going to venture at least some superficial judgments about the nature of the spiritual life in Islam, in as much as we can speak about it. Again, as I did with theology, I'd like to go back to the beginning and the archetype. What's the foundation of all discourse about ihsan, about the spiritual life of Muslims? Well, obviously, it's revelation itself. Heaven is too high for human beings to be able to build and lift up a stairway to it. We need God to lower a stair from above, and it's then our responsibility to climb it. So the basic obligation and purpose of religion is to find and to understand and ultimately to climb that stairway that leads upwards. In fact, it's not just the basic obligation of religion, it can be seen as the reason for our very creation. In Islam's understanding, God, being perfect, wishes his perfection to be known. His perfection, in this view, is only complete when it is witnessed. Classical image is the peacock's tail must be unfurled. Hence the inevitability of manifestation, this apparently impossible paradox of why anything other than good should exist. So Islam sees the spiritual life as a kind of natural, innate human response to the very fact of our existence, confronted constantly, however much we may distract ourselves from the fact, constantly confronting what Heidegger called our thrownness, the mere inexplicable fact of our existence as self-conscious souls in this extraordinary world. So we find a volition within God to create the world, a necessary volition, not quite the Neoplatonic idea of the inevitable constant emanation of the world as part of the divine perception. It's very much in the Semitic tradition of God creating in time. So this volition within God to bring the world into being is seen by the Muslim thinkers as a necessary unfolding or manifestation of the divine perfection. And as I mentioned in my previous lecture, it's specifically that aspect of perfection which the Qur'an calls the divine compassion, Remember, I said that in a certain perspective, God looks out upon all of the latent, uncreated beings, and in his infinite compassion has pity on them because they're still in the imperfection of non-existence. So he breathes upon them and bestows upon them the blessing of existence. Again, this feminine idea of rahmah, of the divine compassion, the divine engendering of the world. So this is essentially why the world exists. It is the simple manifestation of the divine volition to be known in the register of the divine love and compassion. The world is the solidification, in this view, of divine love. That's all very well, but it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why human beings should exist. Inanimate objects in creation, all right. But actually self-conscious, discrete souls that seem to have a separate, conscious, distinct existence apart from God, that's even more complicated. According to the Qur'an, the human creature was distinguished from the rest of the clay of creation by receiving the breath of God's Spirit. So the world is generically the breathing out of God into non-existence. But the human being is a special case. You'll find this in Surah 15, verse 29. Man is a representation, not, as is the rest of the world, just of the divine love, but of something more exalted still, namely of the divine intellect. The Quran says that Adam was taught all of the names. Again, this comes from this quasi-Genesis-like passage at the beginning of Surah 2. And this teaching of Adam of the names is said to mean that man alone, out of all of the endless ramifying phenomena of creation, can grasp the phenomena of the world through abstract categories rather than through the senses and simple blind instinct. Uniquely, human beings share, albeit in a clearly contingent way, in the divine ability to assess and to know. Unlike the animals also, they can be held morally accountable for their decisions. So when a mosquito bites you, for instance, it's not just that your understanding of the mosquito is different from its understanding of you. It's not that you have a bigger brain. There is actually a categoric distinction between you and the mosquito. Mosquito is simply following its instincts. It's ultimately reducible to a machine. The human being can take decisions of a completely different order, such as whether to kill it or not, for instance. So, a trivial example, but it illustrates this assumption that the Qur'an is proposing, that there is a categoric distinction between human beings who are ensouled creatures and the rest of creation. And this also entails, of course, that unlike animals, we human creatures can be held accountable for our actions. This is the meaning, obviously, of the Prophet's declaration that man is made in God's image. Man has this extraordinary ability to decide, to recognize good and evil. It's not to be understood in some crude anthropomorphic sense. So we immediately see that the Islamic vision attributes a very high status to human beings. God made Adam, this Quranic passage continues, beginning of Surah 2, his Khalifa. Key term for the mystics, meaning his vicegerent, rather strange Jacobean word, but it's the nearest thing we have in English, his representative, his lieutenant on earth. And he commands even the angels to bow down before him. This is because the angels have not been taught all of the names. They do nothing but constantly worship God in a perfectly obedient way. Whereas man has this ambiguous capacity to worship God if he chooses, and hence become higher than the angels. He also has the ability to refuse to recognize the existence and goodness of God, and hence become lower than the animals, which at least can't be taken to account. So man has this extraordinary range of options. So again, in this sense, man does have a mysterious semblance of free will. And this is where the free will argument kicks into mystical questions. Without free will, there can be no self-discipline, no spiritual wayfaring, because spiritual progress is a gift from God granted only when the seeker turns freely and sincerely to him. And this turning is in fact a returning. The Qur'an doesn't really have a concept of repentance. This is the first step in the spiritual path in all traditions. Instead, it uses this word tawbah, which means turning round, reorienting yourself. And the reason why it uses this term is because of its anthropology, its understanding of who and what man is. The Qur'an explains that before the creation of the world, God summoned all the human souls that would be breathed into the world. He summoned them to his presence, and he asked them, as the Qur'an says, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And they replied, yes, we testify, we bear witness. And the Qur'an goes on to say, that was so that you might not say, of this we were unaware. Might be an excuse you could come up with at the judgment. And so all of us, as the Muslim poets put it, weeping bitterly as we move out of the divine presence and enter the world and behold for the first time that which is not God, retain somewhere within our souls a memory of that primordial covenant with God. The Persian poets famously call it the Ruzi Alast, the day of Am I not your Lord? If you read Rumi, you'll see it constantly invoked. Rumi says, for instance, we were born to be the companions of the angels. Let us go there again, friend, for that is our country. That urging us to reflection and to spiritual progress. So human beings in the world have a passional aspect which they share with the animals. In that sense, they are of the world, but they nonetheless are the shrines of the ruh, of the spirit, which is yearning for the return to that country. In fact, those of you who've looked at Rumi's great spiritual poem, the Mathnavi, will see that he actually starts by comparing the human soul to a reed pipe. In medieval Anatolia, long pipes were made out of reeds. And he says that the song of the reed pipe is actually its lament, its mournful desire to return to the reed bed from which it was torn. And the human soul, when God breathes through it, is actually singing the same lament. It's a kind of nostalgia. Now, this nostalgia is generally termed in Islamic spirituality himma. It means something like yearning or longing. One reason why so much Muslim song and poetry is about separation from the beloved. It's a classic theme that the lover has been separated from his loved one, and he has himma, a desire to be reunited with her. And this is an image which our poets very often use for this loving desire to be reunited to the divine beloved. So we have this nostalgia, which is the novice's as yet inarticulate yearning to return to the divine reed bed from which we were torn. And we find so much of the Muslim devotional literature focusing on this question of himma, to celebrate it and also to inspire it in people. Sometimes we'll find wistful poems about heaven, for instance. Sometimes we'll find verses about the fullness of life in God, which our intuition somehow tells us is possible, that somehow in some unimaginable past we shared in the life in God, but which we in our worldly state grasp only very vaguely. So saying common amongst the early Muslims was, people are asleep, and when they die, they wake up. And the task of the spiritual wayfarer is to wake up before you actually die. A famous Bosnian poet, for instance, Hasan Qa'imi, said, O Qa'imi, wake up and see, do you even understand the bed where you are sleeping? Only those who are awake may truly claim to be lovers. One could literally cite millions of other verses by Muslim poets along the same lines. Now that's all very well as the beginning for the spiritual life amongst those people who are gifted with this kind of remembering of what they once had. But what of those souls which feel this yearning only very vaguely or in very infrequent moments, or seemingly not at all? Well, such people are in the Islamic understanding victims of something called the thickness of the world. Fairly direct image. Key mystical term, the kathafa. The veil has become very thick for them. They can no longer see through it to the divine beloved. So these people are victims, as it were, of the negative possibilities of the world. The world, this complex of phenomena in which we find ourselves, is a two-edged sword. It's true that, as the Qur'an says, constantly celebrates, it recalls and reminds us of its divine origin. However, the same world can also veil and obscure it because we become too obsessed with the signpost that we no longer see where the sign is pointing. Most human beings, marinated, as it were, from birth in a kind of worldliness because of their upbringing, because of their culture, distracted by the sheer brilliance and multiplicity of creation, simply find it hard to see through the world and perceive or even intuit what might lie behind it. This error can be both mental. We presume from the evidence of our senses that the world represents all that can exist, which is the error of contemporary philosophy. And also it can be spiritual, because our innate knowledge of God with which we were born, remember Islam doesn't recognize the concept of original sin, our innate knowledge of God which gives us the ability to recognize the works of God as works of God has somehow atrophied. And this problem, which is the product of kathatha, of the illusory thickness of the world, is famously referred to as ghafla. The GH sound is pronounced roughly like this, the French R. It's a kind of guttural R, ghafla. This means heedlessness, forgetfulness. And this is the state of most human beings. And this is why the beginning of the spiritual path in Islam is not so much a repentance as a turning or a returning. Turning away from the things we consider to be real but aren't, back towards what we once knew to be real. It's a remembering, a dhikr. Dhikr and ghafla are polar opposites. Dhikr means remembrance, recollection, also reminding oneself, invocation. Now, the classic Muslim text on how to overcome this sickness of ghafla is, as always, the Holy Qur'an itself. The Qur'an is there to articulate for us a vision of the world which we all had before we were born. Hence, I think it's surprising and to some even disconcerting literary style. The Qur'an's intention is not to supply us with information that we never had, but simply to unearth it from our souls. So the normal discursive linear techniques of, say, history books or novels are simply nowhere in sight in the Qur'an. It speaks directly to the heart, constantly pushing, remembering, challenging. And it has to be listened to with the heart. And there are many verses in the Qur'an itself which indicate this non-ratiocinative nature of God's speech. For instance, where it proclaims, God has placed covers over the hearts of those who have no faith in the other world, lest they should understand it, the Qur'an, and he has set a barrier over their ears. Note, by the way, that the text is not here just referring to Muslims. It merely says that the key to lifting the veil from the Qur'an is faith. So if you come to the Qur'an from a position of unfaith, you will merely see a mirror of yourself in the Qur'an. If you come to it with a higher degree of spirituality, and the Qur'an here suggests that it doesn't have to be something achieved simply or exclusively within a Muslim context, then you will begin to see something deeper. And of course the great saints, their delight famously in Islamic hagiography is that they are inseparable from the Qur'an. They read the Qur'an constantly, they recite from it, they find it a constant delight. As one of them said, the Qur'an is God's banquet. Now, in the Muslim understanding, because this world around us is a manifestation of God, whether or not we are as yet equipped to read it as such, and more precisely a manifestation of God in his aspect of limitless love, it is not fallen. Remember, if you look at the Quranic narratives of the fall, you'll find that Adam makes tawbah, he returns to God, God accepts that, and a line is drawn under original sin. Key distinction between Muslim and Christian types of spirituality is that Islam does not accept an idea of original sin. So the world is not fallen, and as such it almost glows with reminders of its divine provenance. And the Qur'an itself constantly celebrates nature as a system of signs, of ayat, as signposts, reminders of the divine reality. One of the most recurrent and characteristic features of the Quranic text. But in order to appreciate these signs, we have to learn the second basic virtue of Muslim spirituality, conveniently rhyming with the first, the Quranic virtue of fikr, meditation, contemplation. Typical Quranic verse on the theme, for instance, "Verily in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the succession of night and day are signs for people of inward understanding. Those who remember God, whether they be standing, sitting, or on their sides, and who meditate on the creation of the heavens and the earth." In other words, how the heavens and earth are created. "Our Lord, you have not created all this in vain." Now, in texts such as this, the Quran invariably uses as its term for the human agent that grasps this reality is lub, one of the key elements of the Quran's vocabulary. So the verse is saying there are signs in this wonderful creation for those people who have lub, plural albab. Lub etymologically means a seed or a core. So it's here implying that there is a core or something within man that needs to grow and blossom. And this lub here is simply a metaphor for man's immortal, pre-existent, unfallen soul. The Quran is telling us that nature is translucent to those who have kept this lub within them pure. So the very first stage in the spiritual life, the Quran is suggesting, is to look at and try to look through the beautiful forms of nature. And in the Middle Ages, it was a very common form of Muslim piety for people simply to wander God's earth, marveling at the variety and brilliance of his creation. And this principle also helps us to understand why Muslim art and architecture has so often included vegetal and floral motifs. If you look at the mosaics on the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, for instance, or the illumination of a chapter heading in a medieval Quran, invariably you'll see the intertwining of plants and leaves, something which is profoundly satisfying to the Muslim aesthetic, precisely because it recalls this Quranic impetus, this Quranic idea that it is through nature that we perceive the divine. And the convention, of course, as Drs. Tabb and Aman so well explained to you, became more and more conventionalized over the year and stylized until the arabesque was born. The arabesque really is the classical archetypal expression of Islamic decorative art, because it's kind of repeated geometrical image of reality, a statement of the beautiful, intertwining, endlessly consistent patterns which God has set in the natural world, and whose radiance brings art and architecture back into line with the rest of creation. It's one reason, incidentally, why Muslim art has classically preferred abstract or vegetal motifs to human representation. In the Christian perspective, of course, the divine came into the world once only as a man. So the great symbol of contemplation in a church is the icon or the symbol of Christ. Because it's the theomorphic qualities of the God-man that provide the inspiration really for all Christian sacred art, whereas Islam sees the natural world as the manifestation of God's love. Hence we find the natural world invoked, albeit in these very abstract forms, in Muslim places of worship, and the complete absence of any figural representation. And there are a number of poems, and it's a recurrent theme in the spiritual literature and in little pious stories, that all of creation is praising God. This is in the Qur'an. All of creation is praising God. It is simply وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ sorry? Tasbihahum. Thank you. You do not understand their praising, their glorification of God. There's a nice little Turkish story that I heard recently in Istanbul of a saint and his followers. And they were gathered in their little lodge in Istanbul. And the saint was growing very old and he wanted to appoint a successor. And in order to test his followers to see who would deserve this distinction, he said, please go out today and bring me in the evening the most beautiful flowers you can find. And so all of the zealous disciples go around, and in the evening, some of them bring bunches of carnations, others bring beautiful tulips, roses, or whatever. And then one rather simple little man called Merkez Efendi comes with a dead flower and sets it humbly, apologetically before the saint. And everybody else is absolutely shocked, and they say, what is this? This is an insult. But Merkez Efendi explains it by saying, well, I went out into the world and I saw all of the beautiful flowers, but they were all praising God, so I was ashamed to pick them. Then I found one that had stopped, so I brought you that one. That's a fairly typical Muslim pious story that indicates how the natural world is seen as being something that is very much part of the divine order. So I've spoken briefly about fikr and also introduced this concept of dhikr. I think since it's 10:30, you're probably in need of some material as well as spiritual sustenance. But as I say, because I've got so much to get through today, if we can be back within 15 or 20 minutes, I'd be grateful.